Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. We are so excited to have you. It is April 2nd, 2019, and we are coming to you today, live streaming on Facebook, beginning with my wonderful partner.
Thank you. I'm Margie DeLynn. Happy to be here.
From Wichita, Kansas.
Natasha Helfer-Parker, happy to be here as well. Hello, everybody. Happy spring.
And I'm Dr. John DeLynn, and we are going to be continuing today our discussion around communicating with church leadership, ward members, and neighbors if you happen to live in a Mormon densely populated area after a Mormon faith crisis. We're very excited to have you, and let's just go around the horn and have each of our co-hosts today just tell us a really briefly tiny bit about themselves. Margie?
Okay. Life coach that focuses on the area of life transitions, and a writer for Beauty in the Now website, as well as podcaster. That's me.
Beautyinthenow.org. That's your website.
Yep.
And you're super wise and experienced in all things. Natasha, tell us about you.
I am a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist, have been for over 20 years. I'm also a certified sex therapist, have been working in the areas of faith transitions for over a decade now. So lots of great experience working with lots of people all over the spectrum of belief and relationships. So whether it's mixed faith or both leaving or both trying to be nuanced, things like that. So it's exciting. Where you can find my work is natashaparker.org. I see people professionally. I have providers who work for me. I blog, I podcast. So everything that I do, you can find a link to something on natashaparker.org.
Awesome. And I am Dr. John DeLynn. I am the host of Mormon Stories podcast. I do a tiny bit of coaching. I have a PhD in clinical and counseling psychology, and if you really bug me enough, I will make time for you. If you really have need, you can research. You can find my blog or website at johndelynn.com. You can email me at drjohndelynn@gmail.com. But mostly, I just live to support people who are going through a religious transition, help them find healing and growth and joy and community after Orthodox Mormonism. So thanks for joining us, everybody. And really quickly, we have a few announcements to make. Natasha, why don't you tell everybody about the webinar that we're doing?
Yeah, so we're really excited. Starting tonight, we are going to offer a 3-week 2-hour each week webinar specifically for mixed faith couples, marriages, when one person is maybe transitioning and another isn't. This is oftentimes a very painful and kind of trepidatious type of path to be on. It can be really hard for both partners, and we've presented on this issue multiple times, always with great reviews. One thing that I really, really take pride in is getting the feedback that both the believer and the transitioner feel safe and heard and validated, and like these events really benefit both of them. I take that very seriously. So we're excited to offer that in a webinar form. In the past, we've really just offered these kind of as workshops, and we travel and do them in different geographical spaces, but that's pretty limiting for a lot of people who may not be able to go where we are presenting. So this will be a resource that will be available now on our website. You can join us tonight. The positive of joining us tonight is that it will be interactive, so you can ask us questions as we go. But we will be recording it and then making it available as a one-time purchase type of product that you can access at your convenience. So we're really excited to kind of start building on these resources for you to be able to tap into.
And you'll be able to find this webinar at mormonfaithcrisis.com once it's ready. Shout out to our listeners. Lindy is joining us. JD and Shelly and Allie and Marissa are all joining us. So shout out to them and everyone else who's about to join us. Really quickly, we have a few events coming up. April 10th, which is in a little over a week, Dr. Julie D'Azevedo-Hanks and I will be doing a mixed faith marriage retreat in Salt Lake City. We have several couples signed up. We're excited to have you, so please sign up for that. That's April 12th through 13th in Salt Lake City. I'll be presenting April 10th for free in Salt Lake City at 7 p.m. at the Community of Christ building about rebuilding a life or building a new life after a faith crisis. You're welcome to join us. And we want to announce the Thrive Conference. So there's a new conference June 7th through 9th in Salt Lake City called Thrive, Healing and Joy Beyond Mormonism. I can't tell you all how excited I am about this. We have so many cool speakers lined up. The topics are navigating a Mormon faith crisis, healthy marriage and committed relationships, improving mental health and spirituality, healthy parenting, finding new friends and community, healthy sexuality, navigating a mixed faith marriage. We want to help you find friends and community, know that you're not alone, get some tools and tips and tricks to navigate your journey. Natasha will be there, Margie will be there, Julie D'Azevedo-Hanks, Christian Moore, Anthony Miller, John Larson, David Bacavoy, Jenny Morrow, Zelf on the Shelf, Alan Mount and Katie Mount from Marriage on a Tightrope, Steve Holbrook, Crystal and Sean Escobar, and many more. So seating's limited. Only 90 people are going to be able to attend. $99 if you sign up in the next few weeks. After April 20th, the pricing goes up to $199 per person. No one's making any money off this. It's 100% just to help people in need. So go to thrivebeyondmormonism.com if you want to sign up for that event. Those are our announcements. Let's turn to our what's working, because this is a section we do each time where we share things that are working for us. And Natasha, you have something you wanted to share.
Yeah, I think every spring I get into this mode of looking around and going, oh my goodness, my house is a mess, my life is a mess, my kids are a mess. It's probably that nesting, right? Like we got to clean everything out for spring. But a lot of times what happens with that type of, mindset is that you can get really down on yourself, like nothing is right. So I've just been looking up some mantras for dealing with mom guilt, which I think is a fairly common phenomenon. So I thought I'd share some of those with you. So as far as, for those of you who are working moms or moms who are trying to manage some type of, career identity and also parenting, I really liked the mantra. It says, I'm showing my children the value of hard work. I'm doing this for me. I'm doing this for them. Instead of, I think a lot of times working moms get this kind of weird pitting of, you're doing something for yourself versus for the kids, or that they have to be in competition. Like working can be something that everybody, it's for everybody. And kids, it's a good example for kids to know that moms have to figure that out too, especially coming from our background, right? Where we haven't been role modeled that as much in Mormonism as far as working moms. Another one that I wanted to, a lot of times you hear these mantras like, oh, the kitchen can wait, and because your kids are growing up so fast, and so don't worry so much about the to-dos. But then, the to-dos catch up with you, and they can really start making you feel like a little like you're drowning. So one thing that says, the dishes will wait, but so will my kids. Yes, kids grow up fast, but not that fast. And if doing the dishes makes me feel better, then I'm going to scrub away.
Yeah.
I like that one a lot, because it's like, I think sometimes we can have this idea that, oh, I'm missing out. I need to be there for every single thing. And, kids are there. They're there all the time. Yes, 10 years go by and you can have those thoughts of, oh my goodness, I wish I would have spent a little bit more time. But the reality is that we have busy lives. And in the moment, it doesn't feel that way as much. And that's okay too. So I think it's good to remember those things in balance. So those were the two mantras that I really liked, that I found.
Love that, Natasha.
Love it. Thank you for sharing, Natasha. Margie, what's working for you?
So what's been working for me lately is food prep. And so I've been focusing on getting a lot of fresh food. It's spring. So I'm looking at like fresh fruit, vegetables. And what I've started doing is on grocery days, taking a moment actually to prep the food So chopping up carrots, having snap peas in see-through containers, as well as washing little bunches of grapes. Or anyway, that's something that I have found it's made it more accessible to eat in a healthy way.
And I love the veggies and the fruit that you provide for us.
Thank you.
It's yummy stuff. All right. Well, what's working for me? I listened to a Sam Harris episode about a book called Zucked, which is a book about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, ironically, as we live stream over the Facebook platform. And the podcast with Sam Harris is all about Google and Facebook and how, they do good things, but they do some very problematic things, and they have some very significant and sometimes problematic influences on our lives and on society. And that, along with some other things, just inspired me to do something really radical, which is to take all social media apps off of my phone. Now, that doesn't mean that I am getting off all social media, but it does mean that I've found that when I have social media apps on my phone, I'm more distracted. I'm sometimes not as connected to my wife and kids. Sometimes I drive and look at these apps, which is terrible. And it's just not always good for my mental health. So I've just decided that if I'm going to be on social media, I'm going to do it very deliberately when I'm at my computer or at my laptop, and when it's in more of a controlled environment where I can just be more deliberate about it. And that's something that I'm going to try.
I really love that. Love that. So I love the reflect and edit. You're reflecting and now doing something a little bit different.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
All right. Well, that's it. Let's jump into today's episode. We are continuing our conversation that we started 2 weeks ago on communicating with church leadership, board members, and neighbors after a Mormon Faith Crisis. So far, we've already talked about taking a private approach. We've talked about taking a direct approach. And we've talked about how to handle callings. And that reached 2 hours, and we just decided that we wanted to take a break and come back and talk more. So today, we're going to be talking about a few more topics within this very delicate situation of how to deal with church leadership, board members, and neighbors once you've had a faith crisis. We're going to be talking about the ministering program or the home teaching, visiting teaching program, what to do about that. We're going to talk about what to do about the risks and realities of being a topic of discussion, you and your family at ward council meeting or bishop's council or whatever it's called, how to deal with that. We are going to talk about setting healthy boundaries with church leaders and ward members and neighbors. We are going to just talk about what you do when you run into ward members and church leaders after you've either stopped attending or you've kind of changed your relationship with the church in some way, and after you stop attending altogether. And we'll also talk a little bit about seeking community and support and some other statements. Now, all of these topics, we've already solicited comments and stories from you, but fortunately we have several listeners who are live. And so if you're joining us live on Facebook right now, we would love your questions, your comments, your stories about these topics, about ministering and home teaching, about ward council, about setting boundaries, about running into ward members and leaders. And we will read and include those. They make our discussion much more rich. How does that sound, everybody?
Sounds good.
We ready? Okay, so let us begin and let's talk about the home teaching, visiting teaching / ministering program. Now, Natasha, we're going to admit that Margie and I sort of left Mormonism before the change from the home teaching and the ministering program were kind of implemented. Is there any way that you could give us a little bit of an update on what that is for those who kind of left the church or stopped attending church before that happened?
Well, and not that I'll do necessarily a phenomenal job at it either, but it's really, I think, a move away from having it be so it's an attempt to move away from having it be very, like checklist oriented approach to, I think, a more let's really look at what's a best fit and how, like instead of before it was like, okay, once a month you should, go visit everybody, have a message, no matter what their situation is. It kind of always was the same thing. And then there was a huge kind of focus on statistics, right? Are we doing our visiting teaching or not? And what are your numbers? What are your stats? How you felt yourself about whether or not you were doing the job correctly had a lot to do with how the implementation. So I think this ministering approach is really an attempt to get away from that type of rigidity and have a more flexible approach where, and even the term ministering, right? It's like that implies like, let's be helpful. Let's, see what people really need and what type of support they're looking for in their lives. And so maybe it isn't once a month, or maybe it's 3 times a week, right? Depending on the situation or the time frame that's going on. What's that family going through at a particular time in their life? And maybe the messages don't have to be so rigid either, like depending on where that family is at. You come up with things that seem to be more, the authority lies more within the people involved instead of like this system coming in and saying, this is how you have to do it. So that's my general overview. It still functions fairly similarly. I mean, you're still assigned families. And, we've been assigned a minister in our home. So, he comes and visits us from time to time. So it's not completely different, but I think it has some logistical, at least overall overview that is trying to be different about it.
Okay. And what has your experience been, Natasha? Now, interestingly enough, we have not been assigned ministers in our Salt Lake City ward. We do have children who are still of record, but it's possible we're on some do not contact list out of fear. You're not sad about that? No. Margie's not sad about that.
For us,
so
works.
Are you either currently ministering or being ministered to, Natasha?
Yeah, so we do have a home minister. So, I think, and this is maybe where we can just start talking about how many different situations there are.
Yeah.
So, some people don't want to have contact with their ward in this kind of way. They don't want ministers. They don't want visits. They don't want to be surprised. They don't want to have cookies left on their porch. Other people
Who
really
want cookies. What are you talking about?
the pity cookies, I guess. Or I wouldn't turn away cookies. Even the pity cookies are fine with me. But
Margie wants veggie sticks.
Yeah, veggie sticks.
I like cookies too.
I think some people really want that connection or want to feel connected, even if they're maybe not attending on a regular basis. Some people have a mixed faith, situation where either one of the parents or some of the kids are more involved than others. And that tends to be our situation in our home right now. And I will say that, just my own personal experience with this has been very interesting, right? Because when we had an event in our home several years ago where we kind of from one Sunday to another decided, specifically dealing with one of our kids, that we could no longer attend the way that we were attending because of how she was being treated. So that was a very stark thing. And it wasn't something that we had predetermined or thought about. It just, the situation came up and we had to deal with it. So, and at that point, we've been very active, very involved, callings, everything, to like nothing. So from one week to the next, we stopped attending and they stopped engaging. Like we all kind of took a break. And that was extremely painful for me. I thought that I would be having at least the visiting, back then it was visiting teachers still come and home teachers, or that we'd have some type of visits. And what was also strange since the ward kind of opted out of doing that with us, every now and then the missionaries would show up. but I was confused, right? I was like, well, are you showing up because we're on your inactive list? Or is this like the ward trying to reach out to us? Does the ward even know that you're showing up at my house? like what, so the missionaries, because they're kind of doing their own thing too, right? So you've got this ministering program, but you've got also the missionaries that may or may not be tracting into your home. So you've got all these kinds of different systems that you're trying to figure out. And at that particular point, it was very hurtful for me that they stopped ministering to us when I really needed ministering to. At this particular point, we have a very kind, minister. So he comes to our home. It's been interesting. He's interested in talking about doctrinal stuff, and we can talk a little bit more about that. I'm not interested in that. I don't think that's going to go anywhere.
Well, tell us about that. So how do you deal with that?
Well, he's like, I really enjoy robust conversations, and I really enjoy having different perspectives. And I would say, out of all the people in our ward, they did a good job picking the person who's going to come visit us, because he's fairly nuanced. He's in a mixed faith marriage himself. He's not, ignorant to some of the issues, historical issues and things of that nature. So he's probably the best fit for us. And yet,
does he know you're a celebrity rock star Mormon?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Anyway, so then but he wants, I think he has his own way of having made sense of these things in his life, because there's so many different ways people can, as we know, as we've been talking about, many different ways that you can take the same information, have it mean or fit into your spiritual journey in different ways. And so when he says, well, why, what do you think about this particular issue? Take any issue, I don't know, polygamy or whatever. I already feel weird. Like, what am I going to say that is different than how you perceive that and how you fit that into your life? And you're you can't just, it puts you into that situation of we're going to somehow be argumentative about the way we look at it. And I would just rather avoid that. My husband, on the other hand, loves that and wants to get into that. And I'm like, right? So I don't know. We'll see how it goes. I mean, he's only come a few times, and I try to practice the same things I talk about here. For me, this is how I see it. For me, especially, it's interesting, all the things too, that, it's a reminder of things I used to say. That's hard. Mm-hmm. It's hard when you have nuanced people saying things, for example, that, well, we love the sinners, but just not the sin. That's something I used to say, right? And when they're talking about LGBTQ folks, like, my triggers now go up exponentially, right? And my mama bear comes out, my advocacy person comes out. I have to remember, I used to say those things, right? And so I really try to find ways that, listen to them, and because I can see that they're really trying to make sense of a paradigm within their own paradigm that's moving away from an older paradigm that they had. So they are making progress, but it's still something that I think LGBTQ folks would find very offensive. So I just try to say something simple like, yeah, I used to come at it from that perspective too. And the more I've talked to people who are in that situation, I realize that doesn't feel loving to them, or that's not enough for them, or that's not. So I've come to understand it from a very different perspective, now, even from that. So glad you're thinking about it differently, but it's hard, right? It's hard not to be just like, that's so inappropriate, or that's, this is why I'm leaving, or this is why I'm struggling, or this is, it's very hard in those situations. And I think too that, especially with missionaries, when missionaries have come, I've had to make some very clear boundaries. Like, we will always feed you. We will always give you water. We will always, talk to you. Tell us about your lives. We are so supportive of what you're doing. Tell us about, your struggles or your celebrations. But then when they start getting into doctrinal stuff with us, we're like, I've just said to them, these are conversations our bishop or Relief Society president needs to be having with us, not you. So kind of like letting them off the hook. Like, they're in a different realm, right? They're doing other things. They're ministering to people in our city who really struggle at a whole nother level, and they don't need to be having doctrinal discussions with the Parkers.
Yeah.
So
I love it.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks for sharing your
with
experience.
that.
You'll have to update us from time to time as to what happens in your ministering journey and experience.
Yeah, it's a nice hot mess. It always is. And then here's another one. So my son just went through a Temple Recommend interview, right? And so I go all the time with him, and so he went through all the questions, and I remember talking to my kiddo and saying in front of the bishop, saying, just so you know, kiddo of mine, in my mind, I can say yes to all of those questions. So it's just that the church has a different way of thinking about those questions than I do. So I said that in front of the bishop, and I said that in front of my kid, because again, this is kind of that idea that I don't want the church to somehow usurp my parental authority, right? So like I'm square with all those questions in my own way of viewing things, but I also understand that the church has different ideas about how those questions should be answered than I do. I said that in front of the bishop, in front of my kid. So that was kind of that was advocating for myself as a parent, right? So that's another example of just something recently that I did.
That's probably good modeling for your kid.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then the bishop was like, well, let's talk about that. And I'm like, well, we can, but you know where that's going to go, right? So I just wanted to make sure that it's not like my kid, is wondering, well, what if this is my mom going to say no to? Why doesn't she have a Temple Recommend currently, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to make sure that my kid understands that I'm plenty worthy to be his mom.
Right.
Shelley writes, love your perspective on all of this, Natasha. So Shelley likes what you're putting down. Lori, who's joining us live, she writes, I remember a lady in the Relief Society presidency calling all the ladies she met with to repentance if they were not 100% faithful in their visiting teaching. I remember even then thinking that would have pissed me off and I would never have done visiting teaching again. Mm-hmm. So Lori's reflecting on why they made changes to the home teaching, visiting teaching programs, because the truth is it was really burdening the church because most members weren't doing their home teaching, and it was always these aggressive elders quorum presidencies or high priest group leader presidencies or Relief Society presidencies that would take it upon themselves to visit all the people that weren't getting visited, and that was just taking people away out of their homes, away from their families, and it was just causing a big burden and stress on the church. So and it was turning people off, and it was just reminding everyone every week that the church is failing at a program. And so credit to Russell Nelson for seeing that and just accepting it and making a change. We want to invite everyone who's joining us on Facebook Live to share their experiences with ministering really quickly. We'll read them on the air. We'll only use your first name, but we'd love to hear how you're dealing with ministering, what you think about it, how you've approached it if you've left. We do have a few comments that we'll read from many of you. We'll start with Aaron. Natasha, do you want to read Aaron's comment on ministering?
Yeah. My Relief Society president has a militant personality.
Do we have to read? Oh, keep going, sorry.
Okay. And takes her calling very seriously. The consistent checking up on my ministering was becoming a bit stressful. I decided to send her an email asking to please be removed from the ministering program. She still has never replied. She did, however, show up at my door unannounced with one of her counselors to hand deliver a spiritual message, the church meeting hours and address attached at the bottom. I guess I've been demoted to less active status.
So what's your reaction to Aaron's situation, Natasha?
Well, I do think that, anytime that there's a boundary that you place that's different from kind of like what's the norm in Mormon kind of day-to-day how we live land, is you're going to get a little bit of that concern. And I remember way before, like even when I was super active, telling my bishop, look, I cannot be part of the visiting teaching program back then because I've decided to be a therapist in the area, and I don't want to have to tell somebody, oh, they can't be my visiting teacher, or I can't teach them, because that would be a dual relationship. I felt like it was very, I was trying to figure out my dual relationships with being a therapist and being a ward congregant. And so I just opted out of the program. And I remember him telling me at that point, Natasha, this is really concerning to me, because even though I understand where you're coming from and where, kind of your ideas about this, this is the start of a slippery slope. And he used that language, which is kind of typical language we use. And, this is going to be, maybe part of, you not having the support, or you not, just the classic narrative that we have in Mormonism, that if you're not doing it the quote unquote right way, that somehow you don't fit in the norm. And why Mormonism is so oftentimes lumped in those religions where we have so many markers and we're seen as, only one step away from fundamentalist religion, is kind of examples like this. Because even just a very clear boundary, a very simple boundary, something that shouldn't mean a lot means a lot. It now means you're not participating in the way that the tribe expects you to participate in. And yeah, now you're on our concerned list.
Yeah.
So how'd you deal with that?
With my bishop's situation?
Yeah, just being flagged that way and being talked to in a way that maybe made you feel othered or talked down to, or, flagged, or however you felt.
Yeah. So you mean, how do I still deal with that on a regular basis?
Yeah. It's not fun. I know that sometimes when I've presented with you, John, you talk about the Nephi effect, right? And how I have always been such a huge part of my wards and my communities, and, tons of leadership callings, tons of service opportunities. And so to be all of a sudden finding myself in that position where I can tell people don't trust me as much, or are concerned about me, or kind of, and even though I know it comes from a loving, concerned place, it still feels condescending, because it still feels like she's not doing what she should be doing. She's not looking at it from the right perspective. She's being deceived. She's being prideful, right? Whatever those types of, it's the microaggression, right, that we have towards people who don't quite fit in the box. And so that's been a huge humble pie to have to eat, because I like being seen as the great gal, right, that comes in and can save the day, or can be helpful, or can participate, and that, people are going to like me and find what I have to say valuable. And I used to be that, in my Mormon communities, and not so much, anymore. Yeah. So it's painful. It's hard. But it's kind of, since I continue to engage with it, it's kind of this ongoing, continual invitation for me to be humble and self-advocate. And that's a constant tension that I'm dealing with, especially as my one kid in particular is really enjoying his involvement in our community, in our ward community. So trying to support him. So it's an ongoing invitation towards things that are hard for me.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I noticed that Aaron Gluth Spencer just joined us. Aaron, we just read one of your comments, so you'll have to go back and listen. Thanks to Aaron for sharing. My awesome niece, Allison, has written in. She writes, I always felt bad when ministering ward members would show up out of the blue on a weekday evening around 8:30 or 9 p.m. in the San Francisco Bay Area to try to come by and talk. Their time would be so much better spent spending time with their own young families rather than catching myself and my dear husband, shout out to John, off guard as we get ready for bed ourselves.
Yes, I really feel for this comment a lot. And I remember times in Logan where people would come by also at that time when the kids were coming home from school, where you're trying to get them to swim lessons or and they would just show up and ask if they could come in. I'd be like, we're on our way out. Is there something you needed? Is there something? And so I think oftentimes that that the off guard and not scheduled part was always really hard for me, to be honest.
So how do you handle it? How would you handle it?
Just like I said, I'd say, we're on our way out. Is there something you needed? Is there something that I can help you with real quick?
And then they can check their box off. But they're trying to change that. Anyway, it's just a little bit of a awkward kind of mess.
I really relate to that, though.
But I'm sure with good intentions. I'm sure everyone just wants to love and support everyone. Now, Margie, let's have you share. You mentioned you wanted to share our experience with home teachers, and I'll chime in. But this was before the ministering program, but it was something to actually, I don't know, to be aware of or to watch out for. What do you want to share?
Well, I just was reflecting how we've really kind of been all over the map with this. I think there are times when, you were a home teacher, I was a visiting teacher. There were times when we didn't accept home teachers. I didn't teach at all. There were times where we also had home teachers, but then had discussions about the types of things we were willing to kind of hear if they were going to come into our home and kind of talk to us that way. So I feel like we've taken a lot of different approaches, and I really like that. I really like this idea of a tailor-made approach that you actually can reflect on what you need or what you value from ministering, and really, as best you can, boundary and communicate around those values or intentions that you want. So an example of this would be kind of in our later-ish years in Logan. We had a home teacher come, and I remember we had a discussion with the home teacher and said, hey, so great if you want to come and kind of visit our family. Here are some topics that we would love to hear about. And pretty much nothing else, love, if it's about charity or service or,
kindness, inclusiveness, honesty, just basic moral values. We said no doctrine, no theology, basically.
Yeah, so I just think that's really important, is to take a minute and actually reflect on what you would like out of the experience and then be able to communicate accordingly. When I was a visiting teacher for many years, I always felt like people were really hard to get a hold of or didn't really want to have me come over. And so that made it kind of difficult because I'm kind of private and really respectful of people's time anyway. And then I had sometimes people who would come over who would want us to visit, but then I could tell didn't love the lessons from the Ensign. So I really adapted a lot of times. And for the most part, I never read a lesson out of the Ensign. I would just communicate on my time when I was responsible for the lesson. I would just communicate with them. And so anyway, the idea of tailor-made and really a sense of empowerment for what type of experience you want to have and what your family or you yourself need.
As we're on that topic, there's something to watch out for. And I think we were an extreme case.
Yeah.
But this was going down the few years before my excommunication. I was starting to become known as a public figure more and more. And in my case, several of our home teachers or ward members were asked to actually spy on me and our family. So while they were coming to our home, posing as home teachers or visiting teachers or, and giving us messages and expressing love, they were actually monitoring my Facebook, monitoring my social media, trying to gain entry into private groups that I was a member of, and sharing all that information back with my bishop and stake president. And that evidence was then used in my disciplinary council. So if you, think that you are of concern to the ward and stake, and if you think it's a possibility that you are being monitored and potentially tracked, you do want to consider how much you share and how much access you give to ward members and ministers, because it is not beyond the church in let's just say, more high profile situations for the ministers or to be used kind of as reconnaissance, as intelligence gathering representatives, even if they do that secretly. And that ended up being something we felt very betrayed about, very violated, very, very hurtful, because these were people that would come into our home, we would show them love, and secretly they were gathering information and submitting it to the bishop and stake president.
And asking questions of our children and us in the guise of a trust, like more of a trust relationship. Trust was built around that, like, oh, I really respect that. I really want to show up for you guys, and I just really value. So that, I think that's the sense of betrayal, which all goes back to really good boundarying. And when the time came, you had a very direct conversation with this one in particular about, you know, why we wouldn't be having him in our home. And he actually tried that boundary a number of times, coming over with gifts where, you know, at the doorstep, unannounced, after we had communicated that. This can be tricky stuff. And so, you know, we'll get to that point later about actually practicing good boundarying, what you say, how you say it, because it can be difficult. It can be challenging.
Well, and the one thing I would add to all of this is where you really need to be careful, especially if you're a mixed faith marriage or mixed parenting faith, right? So, because what you don't want is, you don't want the ward to start acting like, or for your kids or your your non-believer or believer spouse to feel like there's an inappropriate triangle being formed, so that, let's say you have a non-believing spouse, for example, and, you know, it feels like the ministers are kind of in collusion with your believing spouse. That can be very negative for a mixed faith marriage. Or that, yeah, you know, you're like, sure, I'm going to support my kids, but then you feel like all of a sudden the ward is colluding to kind of take parental authority away from you, right, with your own kids. So you have to, this is where boundaries, I agree, have to be very, very direct, and where, you know, what part of what we'll talk about in these webinars that we're going to be offering for mixed faith couples is this idea of how you really create a unified front in your ward, so that you can say, you know, this is how I want my believer to be treated, or this is how I want my transitioner to be treated, and this is how we're working together as a team, and we need your support for our teamwork, not, you know, in collusion with one of us or with the other one of us, which actually will, you know, create problems for our marriage.
Yeah, good point.
Aaron writes, sounds like the mafia. Yes, it felt that way. It felt like the FBI or the KGB, honestly, is more how it felt. Jamie writes, unbelievable. That is so traumatic. I grew up in North Logan. I am so sorry. Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate the love and support. Again, we have to just acknowledge that our situation may be extreme. You know, at that point, I was being listed as one of the top 10 enemies of the church. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I don't want to ever try and characterize that that's going to happen in every ward with every person. But
and we had lovely neighbors. We had, you know, select lovely neighbors who are always, so we're not painting with broad strokes.
Let's go ahead and make a positive comment from Lindy Johnson. She says,
go for it. Do you want to read it?
Yeah, I feel like I've been very fortunate with my experience thus far leaving the church. My ministering sisters have been so great and not making me feel pressured in any way to go to church or hear spiritual messages. They occasionally and casually will ask how I am doing via text, drop a treat off here and there. Even on my birthday a few weeks ago, and my birthday stopped by with a very thoughtful gift. I appreciate their time, energy, and effort to show love for me in a positive way. I know that not everyone has that experience after leaving. Our experience with home teachers was a little frustrating. It felt very forced and goal-oriented. Our home teachers are great guys who just want to do the right thing, but they were very persistent, and if we would try to offer an excuse to not schedule a visit or postpone, then they would suggest another time. Very frustrating. So this is, I think, important for those listening too, who want, you know, because remember, here at Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis, we're trying to offer perspectives for those who are in and those who are out and those who are in between. So I think for those who are in, oftentimes your intentions are amazing and you do want to support and you do want to reach out and you don't want people to feel like, oh, just because you left or because you're less of a believer that now I'm going to think differently of you. You have these wonderful intentions of wanting to still stay in community and in relationship with people, regardless of where they are in the church. Listening is really important to this, and being willing to really meet people where they're at. And it sounds like from what Lindy is saying is that the sisters in her situation were more adept at doing that than maybe their home teachers were.
Yeah, kudos to Lindy's ministers. And Lindy, we love you, so thanks for joining us. We're so glad you're here. Lindy is on the committee for the Thrive Conference, and she's done an amazing job. So shout out to Lindy.
I love that comment too, because I feel like it really does touch on more of the idealistic nature, kind of what potential is there in ministering, which I really like to connect to, because I do feel like there is that potential there, right, of showing up for people, kind of getting outside our own circles and caring about people in our kind of immediate neighborhoods or in our realms there. And that part I really, really love, kind of the people first, that showing up, that, opportunity to personally connect with someone that we may not normally, see or have an opportunity to connect with.
And the language from teaching to ministering is so nice in that way, because teaching, it's kind of like you have to offer something.
Exactly.
You have to offer it in this particular way that it's been packaged.
Yes.
Whereas ministering, that's more about, I care about you. I want to be connected to you. I want to be a part of your life.
I guess we have to give credit to Russell M. Nelson, because he is, in all his changes to Mormonism, to the church, he really, if there's a constant theme, I think some would characterize it as he's making it easier to be Mormon. But I think another even more charitable interpretation of all of these changes, he's trying to make it more Christ-like. And I think this change, at least the intent of this change in the ministering program, is to make it more Christ-like and less bureaucratic. And I think he and the church leaders deserve credit for that. We have a comment from Marcus, who's joining us from Germany. How awesome is that? Marcus writes, my high council called me to repentance for not doing my job as Elders Quorum president in terms of home teaching. He said that my calling is above my family duties. Thank you, Marcus. Natasha, what would you tell Marcus?
Yeah, I think that's just really unfortunate, because I think that we have plenty of messages, actually. I mean, this is kind of the tension that people get, these kind of dual messages at church. On the one hand, we get the message, family is the most important thing, prioritize your family, have less meetings. I've been in plenty of leadership kind of circles where we talked about this. We need to have less meetings, et cetera, et cetera. And then you still get the messages of, you've got to do everything that you're supposed to do, right? And so you're constantly in tension with those kind of principles that are the lived reality when you've got a lay kind of ministry, and the church is dependent on people to do their part. We're not paying people to do these types of roles. So, I think unfortunately sometimes how that translates into ward communities is that there's a small amount of people doing a vast majority of the tasks, and oftentimes getting burnt out in that process, and have a hard time with those who are maybe healthier at knowing how to put boundaries. And it's unfortunate when it goes into shaming tactics and, worthiness types of ways that we talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Margie, read us Jenny's comment.
Sure. So Jenny wrote, I am pretty sure I'm talked about. My hubby is still in the church. I recently found out that a girl that was texting me quite often to invite me to do things was my ministering sister. I kind of figured she was, but I was hoping she was just genuinely wanting to be my friend. But now I think she wouldn't be texting me if I wasn't assigned to her. Last time she texted to invite me, I just ignored her text, and I haven't heard back from her. I hate feeling like someone's project.
What do you think? What would you tell Jenny, Margie?
That I understand, that I really, really validate. And I think this is kind of one of the, the tougher things about ministering, right? Is this idea, like it's very easy to start to feel like someone's project or someone's assignment, and you lose some of that kind of, I don't know, genuineness or the sincerity of just kind of natural connection there.
And it's a tough balance, because on the other hand, you know, it's a safety network that we've developed that's pretty good, you know, that if I'm going through something, I know I have some numbers I can call, you know, if so it's hard, I think, in church communities in general. This, I think, is as difficult as I've attended even different churches here in Wichita. There's a sense of trying to get smaller, you know, you've got a huge congregation, but how do we have smaller groups that can connect and, you know, help each other in these ways that I think we try to do through these other types of programs. So on the one hand, yeah, you want organic friendships. On the other hand, a community wants to be able to have a system in place to be able to reach out when needed. So I think that's a tough balance of knowing how to manage that.
It is a tough balance. And for Jenny, I might ask her to kind of reflect on this particular person, and if she feels like there's potential for something to grow that's independent of agenda, or even if she is feeling isolated or alone or interested, or at this point, if she's kind of feeling more like a type of boundary would be helpful, or at least, or even direct communication saying, hey, I kind of have heard that you've been assigned to minister to me, and, you know, allow to take some control back of what you would like for that to look like.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe some of this could have been avoided with just she didn't know to begin with what the role was. So she felt like, oh, I thought it was this, but then I found out it was that. And
exactly.
That can feel a little not as fun.
All right. Well, let's transition to the next topic. Thank you for everyone who's shared comments so far. We're going to use a transitionary comment. Sydney writes, you know you're being talked about when your family ministering person is a member of the bishopric. So let's transition to the topic of ward council. So for those who aren't Mormon or have no idea about Mormon culture, there is a ward council. In other words, your congregation, your local congregation has various leaders, from Relief Society, the women's organization, to Elders Quorum and High Priest Group, to the youth, to primary for the children. And these leaders get together, I believe, once a week and talk about the ward, the congregation, the leadership, and they also talk about the needs of the members. Anything from so-and-so's having surgery, so-and-so's having a baby, this or that family is in need, how can we do a better job, etc. And one of the big issues facing Mormons who go through a faith crisis or who leave the church is that they can end up as an agenda item on the ward council agenda, which means that several leaders or adults in the ward talk about you behind your back. And let's just assume that in the best of cases, you're either not talked about, or when you're talked about in very loving, supportive, affirming ways that respect your confidentiality and that are only desired to express goodwill, and that all the confidentiality is maintained within that council, and you're never talked about or gossiped about outside of that ward council. That would be, let's just say, the most optimistic of possibilities, but it can also go into areas that make a lot of our listeners very uncomfortable. And we have a huge list, probably 10 or so comments from people who have had not so good experiences. Melissa writes, wait, is this why they keep asking me to lunch? In other words, Melissa isn't in church anymore. All of a sudden, she's getting invitations to lunch, and she's realizing that she's been the topic of discussion as a project or as a problem in her ward council. Kent writes, likely, but I wasn't aware of them. But it was my experience as ward clerk that was one of the reasons for me resigning from the church. I was fully aware of the various reports that are automatically generated listing those who haven't attended meetings in the past 90 days. I even attended some of these meetings, so I knew how these reports are being used to talk about various members or identify some candidates for fellowshipping or ministering. So Kent had an administrative position in the church as ward clerk, and he can confirm that at least in some wards, if not all, they print out lists of members who haven't attended in the past 90 days, and people get talked about and assigned to reach out to and minister to or show concern for or make as projects these people. Margie, do you want to read Justin's comment?
Sure. Having been part of multiple ward councils, I assume everyone who is going through a faith crisis is discussed in ward councils as a project. Most of the time, in my experience, the solution would always be to have someone reach out to the person and attempt to befriend them. Like a solid ward buddy is all that would be needed to bring the person back into the fold. This is why it's hard for me to give anyone from our old ward the benefit of the doubt when they talk to me. I never know if they are reaching out to me because they really want to keep in touch, or if they are reaching out to me because I am now their assigned project.
So Natasha, talk to us from your perspective as a Mormon who still attends, as a mental health professional, as a counselor and therapist to couples and families in faith crisis. What are your thoughts, pros and cons, about these ward councils and how they're often used, and what the effects are of these ward councils on people going through a faith crisis?
Yeah, and again, I think it's tricky because again, what's the opposite option to people have not talk about you, not care if you're showing up, not care if you're part of the community, whether you come or go, nobody really notices. That's an issue too, oftentimes, right? And so again, it's like this really tricky middle ground where I think a lot of people with very good intentions don't often come across in ways that are helpful in situations or that may respect people where they're at. I do think that this particular comment brings up an interesting point where people, in the church might see it as a fellowship problem. And we do have some research to support that people who feel like they fit in or feel welcome in a church environment, not just in Mormon churches, are more likely to continue to attend. So in some ways, friendship is important and connection is important. People aren't going to necessarily continue to go to a community where they don't feel invested. At the same time, there are many issues these days that are way beyond fellowship as to why people choose to feel differently about our church, right? And so this doesn't really take into account, and people really in the ward councils are not prepared oftentimes to know how to handle those issues. So it can feel very, I think, empty or not fulfilling for people who are going through faith transitions. One thing I would just recommend is ask. I know how it goes. I know how ward councils go. I'm sure we haven't been attending. I'm sure we've probably come up. So, and you haven't reached out to me in a few weeks, and I love hearing from you, but it would be helpful for me to know if you reaching out to me is more about just us, or if it's more about something that's been talked about at church. You can be direct like that. I mean, that's one approach. I'm not saying it's the approach. It's one approach. You can be direct with your ward council leaders, and just go in and have a talk with the bishop and say, look, I know how it works. I know you guys care about us. I know you'd prefer for us to continue to come. We may or may not be continuing to come. I would prefer to be left off of ward council meetings or agendas, so that's another boundary you can place. Again, with boundaries, you only have so much control. It's not just because you place a boundary that people will always respect them, but it's a good start. Mm-hmm. And then you can practice with people with how well or not they are doing. And then are we being proactive on the other end? Are we being proactive in the types of relationships we still want to have with particular people? Maybe our closer friends or people who are involved with our children through leadership things or things of that nature. So it's hard. I get it, and I feel bad too, because I've been on both ends of this stick, right? I've been the Relief Society president, worried about a family we haven't heard from, and wondering if they're doing okay, and wondering if we're failing them somehow, and wondering, is there anything we could have done to make them feel more at home here, or where did it fall apart? I've been in that place, and I've also been in the place of what the heck, like, why am I being talked about, and why that has professional implications in my life, that has implications for my community and how people see me, and really angers me, right? So I can really see both sides of this.
Yeah.
It's tricky. I just from my perspective, and this will echo some of the things you said, Natasha, one of the most disappointing experiences for someone going through a faith crisis, let's just say you've served as bishop, or you've served as Relief Society president, you've served as young men's or young women's leader or primary leader, let's just say for years or even decades, you feel like you've given your all to the church, and then you go through a faith crisis and you don't hear from anyone. I hear a lot of post-Mormons and doubting Mormons express a lot of anger and sadness and resentment that they're just being ignored, that they just drop off the face of the earth. And that's a very, very common response. We're like, what the heck? Why did everybody disappear? I thought these friendships were genuine. I thought these relationships were genuine. I served with these people, and now they're just totally forgetting about me and dropping me like a hot potato. That's the reaction on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there's this, don't talk about me, don't gossip about me, don't make me a project. And those are conflicting feelings that questioning Mormons and doubting Mormons and post-Mormons have to reconcile. In some sense, you can't have it both ways. You can't want total privacy and to be left alone and to not be talked about, and simultaneously want people to care about you and show concern, and to not believe that all these relationships were superficial and meaningless. So it's a real conundrum that is at issue. But this could have serious implications. You don't want to be gossiped about. It could affect your job, like you said, Natasha. It could affect your kids and their friendships. A lot of people going through a faith crisis don't want their kids marginalized. They don't want their kids othered or ostracized. They don't want to be judged. Again, sometimes they're orthodontists or lawyers or real estate agents, and they don't want their business negatively affected. And they just want privacy. They want to be able to step away, have some distance, but not be flagged. And so this is tough. It's a really tough balance to walk. And it's going to take a while for us to kind of sort through all this. Margie, why don't you read Lindy's comment?
I participated in many ward councils when I was in the Young Women's Presidency. We talked about less active youth, families, individuals. We all would brainstorm how to get them to attend an activity or feel included. Visiting teaching and home teaching would report to the presidents and would share what I felt to be personal and private information to those visiting teachers and home teachers in confidence in a very public ward council. I never enjoyed that aspect of their dirty laundry being aired in that way to people who had no business knowing. Yeah.
Thank you, Lindy. Natasha, as someone who takes confidentiality very seriously, what should the standard, in your opinion, be for how things like maybe someone's an alcoholic, maybe someone's struggling with infidelity in a marriage, maybe someone is going through a faith crisis, maybe a kid is self-harming, or maybe there's a suicide attempt. These are the sorts of things in a therapeutic context, absolute confidentiality would be observed. If the church came to you, and I know they do, or they will, or they are coming to you for direct advice for how they should manage their work, I'm being a little bit sarcastic. If the church were to come to you and say, Natasha, how do we implement best practices for confidentiality in our ward council and ward leadership settings, what would you recommend?
Well, the way that it's set up, it's already difficult because we're such a revolving door approach to these callings, right? It's not like you have a priest who's going to be part of that community for 20 years and that's going to be the main person who holds all the information. Like, you may have a new bishop, a new relief site president, a new young women's leader, all of this stuff. And so I think it makes it difficult from that perspective too, because just the amount of people that can know about something is huge. Just, if you think about one president with 2 counselors and then they all know, and then 2 of them are released and 2 more people come. Now there's 6 people who know about your issue, right? I mean, it's just the way it's set up is not really set up for confidentiality. I do think that I just wish we were more upfront with things. I wish that it could start right with the ministering who are in the home. I think it's either the ministering or the bishopric. Those are the 2 spaces where they're going to get most of the information. But if if you're a leader and know that you're getting information that's being shared with you, I think it's very important at that point to say, would this be something that it would be okay for me to go tell the bishop about this? Would it be okay for us to talk about this in ward council so that we can know how to support your family? Is this information that you'd want me to share with our counselors, right? I mean, right from that perspective, just to ask for permission would be a really great thing to train people to do. So that, if you're a young woman's leader and a young woman's coming to you with information about her parents, that's an area that a leader can really struggle with. At what point is this confidential or not, especially if there's potential abuse or harm, or those are tricky situations. And I think too, as faith transitioners, this is where it would be very good to be proactive. This is what you can talk about in ward council. This is how we want our family to be talked about. These are our things that we're struggling with. These are ways that we can actually get help from the community. We would like for you to talk to the people in ward council about how we've stopped attending church and our kids feel not as accepted by the kids in the ward anymore. Can you talk to the parents about that? And how they can be helpful in that regard. So again, being much more direct in our approaches. I think we are in this format of relationships with very little boundaries. And so we can role model that either as leaders by saying, is this something that you're okay with me bringing back to somebody else? Or as the people in those situations saying, this is what's okay to talk about, and this is what's not okay to talk about in ward council.
We have some great comments from our listeners. Let's start with Lisa. Lisa writes, I was the ward relief society president, and my husband was on the stake high council. I know when we left, we were talked about all over the stake. I used to think ward council was a great tool, but now that I'm on the other side, I feel it's just a way to spread gossip. One of my friends, and she put friends in quotes, called to tell me when she talked to our elders quorum president. He had said to her that we are, quote, do not contacts, close quote. We never told anyone this. Not only does it spread rumors, it hurts relationships that could otherwise still be friendly. A lot of the things discussed at ward council are personal and should only be talked about with the bishop and the members involved. Too many times I've seen it spread in a ward about a family's personal affairs. This idea of a do not contact list, I don't know if anybody who's listening knows what that is. I'm assuming that someone can request to be on a do not contact list if they just don't want to be contacted or harassed. And I'm assuming that if the bishop or bishopric identifies a family like the DeLynns as being dangerous, they'll be put on a do not contact list for the protection of the ward members. I imagine it can go both ways, but I think that's a really interesting thing that people need to be aware of. If they don't want to be contacted, if they don't want to be discussed, go to your bishop and say, listen, we do not want to be discussed and we do not want to be visited. Put us on that do not contact list, and you don't bother us and we won't bother you.
Yeah, a lot of people are doing this through resignation. I mean, that's kind of one of the main reasons I hear a lot of people being interested in resigning from the church, because then they're no longer on these records. Because, everybody needs to understand that we're very good at record keeping in Mormonism. So every ward has a list of all the people who are, quote unquote members of the church, whether they're inactive or not. And then we use those lists to see, are there people that we should be reaching out to, or that we should, be ministering to, or that we should be helping somehow that we're not in contact with. I remember, again, as a Relief Society president, there were people that we would reach out to and say, hey, do you guys want visiting teachers? No, we don't contact us. So we would put them on the kind of this, we'd just kind of hold a list. I don't know how deep into the membership record that went, but we as a ward community knew to respect that. They don't want us to contact them. And we would let the missionaries know that too, so that they would leave them alone. And they weren't resigning, right? They were still members of the church. So they were still on our monthly lists of people that showed up on our ward directory per se. So that, I think, it's a more informal process that each ward handles kind of on their own accord. But if you want to formally take care of it, then that's one reason why people resign.
Yeah.
All right, we're getting some great comments in. Margie wants to read a comment from Nancy.
I have the bishop's wife and the Relief Society president as my ministering sisters, even though I specifically said I didn't want to have them. On LDS tools, they are listed as such. They don't come over like normal, but we do yoga together, and you better believe every yoga session has some church-related conversation slipped in. Their favorite conference talk and how blessed they are because they were able to find their keys. Even in our group text, thankfully for me, I just like to do yoga and I tune it all out as I go into my headspace for my practice. They are sweet ladies, but sometimes I just can't handle it. I wonder what the response will be when my records are removed. I'm just waiting for them all to be processed. I should hear back by May. But to answer the question, I have felt like a project, and I've had different reactions depending on my mood. I often just let it go and ignore it or smile and nod. Other times I have an angry vent session with my spouse or friend who has also left. The problem with feeling like the project is you feel like a disobedient child, and it's super annoying. I don't like confrontation, so it's usually after the situation that I get upset.
So Margie, what do you do? What would you say to Nancy? Let's just say you've got a group of friends that you are on a text string with or an email chain. Let's just say you do girls' nights outs or yoga or, play groups with the kids. So you've kind of intermeshed your friendships in your community with ward members, and now you're no longer attending. How would you handle that if texts or group chats are seeming to be a lot about church? If you feel like maybe people are starting to suspect and wonder what's going on, do you write an email to everybody and say, hey, this is where I am? Do you ask them not to talk about church so much? Do you just suck it up and say, this was the context in which I entered the friendship or the relationships, and so I'm just going to be quiet and suck it up? What do you do?
I think there's a tendency to want to be a little bit prescriptive here, but I really do feel like it depends on the individual and kind of where they are and the nature and level of the relationship that she is in with these ladies. And if it's still kind of a credit relationship where she's getting more out of it than she feels like she's being debited or she's being depleted. But, it's very, is she out in other ways, in other places in the church, or would this be the first time that she would come out? Like all those things, I think, influence what conversation she would be having.
Let's just say a lot of times everyone knows she's kind of stopped attending. Occasionally she'll wear, sleeveless dresses or shirts. And so let's just say everyone kind of knows her relationship with the church has changed. Mm-hmm. And even though it hasn't been discussed explicitly, she stopped attending, she shows her shoulders, and everybody kind of knows. And so in some of these cases, the religious conversation actually increases. It's sort of like because the friends get alerted or they start to have concern. And so they'll talk about church more than they would have, sometimes in an attempt to kind of get them back. So let's just say it's that scenario.
Okay, well, again, so some individual things to think about would be does she feel like she's at risk for losing the relationships? And I would only know that if I knew kind of the women and their personalities and is that something she's willing at this point to entertain, right? I've been in situations for sure like this, particularly in different places where we've lived, where I did different things at different times.
What are
I would
some
say,
options?
So one option was I minimized my exposure to them. I didn't necessarily trust them with my information or an update. I wasn't ready for that, but it was more of a debit, or became something that I feel like agitated me to be around when I would be out in a neutral space, and then all of a sudden we're talking about church related topics. So I would reduce my exposure. I've done that before. Other times I have chosen to communicate. I did that a lot in Logan, I would say, where I would actually bring up to some effect like, I really value my relationship with you. Let's just play it to the situation. I really love going to yoga with both of you, and really just enjoy associating with you. Things have changed for me with regard to the church where I've stepped away. And I think at this point, I would really love to just kind of neutralize that, or have that not be a topic maybe that we share. You guys feel free to do that together. And I'm going to do the same for you, show you the same, where I won't bring up, particular things, but please know that I really love this space where we get together and where we share. And I really love doing yoga with you. And then from there you get to see how it evolves and how people take it, and I've had it work both ways, where nothing happened after that. And that was the filtering that we talk about in transitioning. And I've also had it where people really did a great job being able to handle that and wanted to still have connection. And so we grew areas that were not church related.